This is Kino, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is Monday, March the 18th, 2024. Happy Monday, everyone. The newspaper is full of Monday kind of news, rather depressing grey news. Vladimir Putin has a new 6-year term in Russia, according to the New York Times. There were lots of protests answering Navalny's call, according to the Washington Post. Navalny, of course, no longer with us. But the Post acknowledges that Putin has extended his role. The Financial Times talks about Putin's ominous 5th term. One wonders whether it's any more or less ominous than his 3rd or 4th or perhaps 6th term. The Journal notes that the Putin quote-unquote election had only one possible outcome, which means that one wonders whether or not really it was an election. The New York Times talks about the election, the vote, as a Potemkin vote, suggesting, of course, Potemkin villages, things that don't really exist, presented as real for the purpose of the West or marketing Russia overseas, but not really true. No one, of course, is particularly happy with this. The West has condemned Putin's re-election, not an awful lot they can do. It all speaks, I guess, to the return to history of Putin as a czar, of Potemkin-style elections. So it's appropriate this morning we're talking with Martin Sixsmith, former BBC correspondent in Russia and an authority now on Russia. He has a new book out. He wrote with his son, Daniel Sixsmith, Putin and the Return of History. Martin is joining us from Hampstead in North London. Martin, a return to history. Did history ever go away in Russia?
It's not specifically a return to history in Russia, but if you remember, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the West declared that henceforth there would only be one viable form of government, and that was Western-style liberal democracy. And Francis Fukuyama very famously wrote a book in 1992 called The End of History, in which he confidently predicted that totalitarianism, dictators, authoritarian regimes were a thing of the past. So the title of my book, Putin and the Return of History, is a little bit of a sort of acknowledgement that history didn't go away, and that Vladimir Putin is taking great delight in proving that liberal Western-style democracy isn't the only possible form of government in the modern world.
Fukuyama, of course, has been quoted many, many times on this idea of the end of history. We had him on the show a few months ago, and he suggested he never really talked about the end of history. In fact, his last book was, in a way, about the history, not the end of history, not of totalitarianism, but of liberalism. Were there people, Martin, who really believed that Russia could reinvent itself as a Western-style liberal state?
Well, I think a lot of us did. I was there in August 1991 when the coup against Mikhail Gorbachev was defeated, with the outcome that Boris Yeltsin came to power, and that 70 years of Soviet communism collapsed overnight. The Soviet Union disappeared. And, looking back at my reports from 1991, I'm struck by how optimistic and upbeat I was, because my line, like Francis Fukuyama back then, was that communism had been defeated, this sort of great social experiment had gone away, and that from now on, one hoped, Russia would become like us. In other words, it would be sort of subsumed into the Western world. It would become a friend of the West, and Russia would adopt many of the things that the Russian people had been looking at enviously for many decades, essentially, freedom, democracy, the right to vote, civil rights, the right to have one's voice heard, and most of all, the prosperity that seemed to bring, that capitalism seemed to bring. So, there was a great deal of optimism back then. And yes, it did seem perhaps that it was going to be a unipolar world, that Washington was going to be leading it. And if Washington was leading it, then the only form of government practicable from then on was going to be liberal democracy.
When you look back, Martin, you said when you look back at some of your reports from Moscow back then, you're a little embarrassed. Was it and you of course weren't the only journalist telling the West what it wanted to hear, this narrative of everyone becoming like us. Was it your narrative? Was it the Western media narrative? Or was there a similar narrative in Russia itself?
Oh, very much so in Russia. You know, the Russian people, don't forget, had been suffering under this dreadful communist regime for many, many decades. And when the communist system collapsed and Western influences came in, there was great optimism among the Russian people. And so for the next 9 years, from the end of 1991 until the end of 2000, when Boris Yeltsin was in power, the Kremlin was very open to be part of the Western system. Yeltsin wanted to forge a good relationship with the European Union, you know, an association agreement with the European Union. He even suggested that Russia could become a member of NATO, which is completely unthinkable now. But there was great openness. I remember, you know, in 1991, Yeltsin sent the head of the FSB to the American embassy in Moscow, and a representative of the FSB told the American ambassador where all the microphones had been hidden in the US embassy. So there was that openness, you know, and you could see it in relations between diplomats, but also between visiting politicians. So there was undoubtedly a window of opportunity, I would say, the whole of the 1990s for something different to have happened.
When you look back at the 90s, and as you know, you were there, who are the key figures? Yeltsin, of course. Some people see him as a stooge of the West. Others see him more heroically. I'm not sure how he should or can be seen historically now. What were the key dates in terms of bringing people back down to earth, of undermining the euphoria of the early 90s?
Well, euphoria is always undermined by financial catastrophe. And in those 9 years of the 1991 to 2000, things just went from bad to worse for Russia. And part of the problem was the West. I mean, that is an unavoidable conclusion that US economists poured in, the Chicago boys, they were called, and they said to Yeltsin, if you want to be part of the West, you want to make sure that the communists don't come back, you have to go for shock therapy, shock economic therapy. You have to liberalize everything overnight, and you have to create a new market style liberal democracy in which the Russian people have a stake. Because if you don't do that, the communists are going to come back and you're going to lose out. And unfortunately, with hindsight, that turned out to be an absolute
whose narrative, Martin? It's a narrative that makes sense, although it sounds slightly too simplistic. Whose narrative specifically was it? Was it Bill Clinton? Was it the heads of banks? Who was telling the Russians this?
It was the banks, it was the investors, it was the people with money. But Bill Clinton himself was certainly the figurehead for that. And he was aware that actually the West was asking Russia to do things which were very, very difficult. So he spoke to his Deputy Secretary of State, Strobe Talbot, and he said, look, you know, what we're doing is we're forcing this on the Russians. Clinton was aware of this, and the sort of shorthand that he and Talbot had was making the Russians eat their spinach. And, you know, it was clear that, you know, we were imposing democracy, if you like. We felt we were entitled to impose democracy and capitalism on the Russians. And there was one time when Clinton came to Moscow and he was talking to one of his officials, and he said, look, you know, this must be really difficult for Boris, for Yeltsin, because we keep saying, here, Boris, here's some more shit for your face. And, you know, so Clinton, with such a sort of pithy expression, he knew that the Russians were being made to do things which was very difficult for them. And the problem was, when everything went wrong, the economy fell apart, Russia started to fall apart, it was the West that was blamed for that. So there was a great deal of antagonism and anger which was imbibed by people in Russia and imbibed undoubtedly by Vladimir Putin.
You mentioned Putin at the time of the overthrow of communism in Russia. Putin was a KGB officer in Dresden. He suggests it was one of the worst moments of his life. He was almost attacked by an angry German mob. He sees this moment as the catastrophe of the end of the Soviet Union. How did it play out in geopolitical terms? What's the narrative? So according to you, and as you argue in Putin and the Return of History, the West imposed, and I'd use that word carefully, I'm not sure if it was really a formal imposition. I didn't give Russia much of a choice. It was either our way or the highway. Russia had to embrace not just democracy, but capitalism. What did this mean for the old Soviet Union as a geopolitical entity?
Well, it made things very hard because, that sort of thing worked in Poland, for instance. So, the Chicago boys had been to Poland. They'd had some success there.
Talk about these Chicago boys. They sound like mafia men. Who are they, Daniel?
They were economists. They were, they were
Milton Friedman. We associate Friedman with the Chicago school.
Yeah.
Did Milton Friedman go to Warsaw?
He didn't go himself.
So what? I'm always a bit wary of these terms, Martin. Who are the Chicago boys?
Harvard economists.
You said they were Chicago, Harvard economists.
Harvard economists. They were called the Chicago boys. That was the shorthand for it. And they did pretty well in Poland. But the difference in Poland was that Poland already, the people, the Polish people, had a memory of a time when they were not part of a stifling central command economy. And the Russians didn't have that. There was just no concept of how a market democracy should work. So, for instance, the way that Yeltsin was going to create this market economy on Western advice was to give out vouchers to the whole of the Russian people, and each voucher would be worth a very small stake in what had been the Soviet economy. And the idea was absolutely laudable, that you would create a share-owning middle class who would then have a stake in the system, in the democratic capitalist system, and would be deterred from overthrowing it or returning and voting for the communists by having a stake in the system. But the psychology just wasn't there. It didn't work because the ordinary Russian people who got these vouchers had no idea what they were for. But some really smart guys, the oligarchs as they came to be known, did know what they were for. So they sent out agents all over the country to buy up these vouchers for a few kopecks, and bringing them all together gave them a massive stake in the Russian economy, and they then used it. So the idea, to create this sort of vast mass of people who had a stake in the system just didn't work out.
So the state was essentially sold to the oligarchs. And what about the geopolitics of the Soviet Union? You mentioned Poland, but of course Poland was never part of the Soviet Union. What about the non-Russian parts of the Soviet Union? You had revolutions, rebellions against the Soviet Union in Ukraine, in Georgia, in much of Central Asia. What's your narrative of that in terms of this period?
Well, it's not my narrative. It's just a fact that in 1991, the Soviet Union fell apart. As you know, there were 15 Soviet republics. The largest in terms of size, population, and wealth was Russia. And after the end of 1991, after December 1991, they became independent countries. As you say, they'd sort of agitated for independence even before the Soviet Union fell apart.
And the Baltic states, of course, as well.
They were 3 of the 15 constituent republics. So all these republics, the Baltic states, more than many, had agitated for independence even while the Soviet Union was still in existence. So they became a thorn in Gorbachev's side.
In terms of your narrative of the economic chaos and catastrophe of the post-Soviet Russia, how do you explain the fact that perhaps the Baltic states, particularly Estonia, have been economically relatively successful? Is that Is Estonia perhaps more similar to Poland in that sense, with a pre-Soviet economic history?
Precisely, yeah, very similar to Poland. Before the Second World War, they were thriving, Western-looking states, and they have done well in the period of their new independence. Ukraine wanted to emulate that model. Certainly a large majority of people in Ukraine wanted to look westward. They wanted to become a member of the European Union. They wanted to become a member of NATO. The problem was that there were very close ties with Russia, which had existed for a long time. And the real problem was that the man in the Kremlin didn't want that to happen. Putin, was horrified by the thought that we'd already lost, the states in the West. We'd lost the former Comecon countries in Eastern Europe. And now it looked like Ukraine, which is historically Russia's greatest and closest ally and partner, was also going to move out of the Russian sphere of influence. And that's what really raised the alarm bells, made the alarm bells ring in the Kremlin, and eventually led to the dreadful catastrophe of 2 years ago when Russia invaded Ukraine, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, because it started.
Martin, your book is called Putin and the Return of History. I want to talk after the break specifically about Putin and his rise. But if we can identify something as Putinism, this nostalgia for the Soviet Union and a return, in your words, to history, was there Putinism in the 90s before Putin? I mean, he was a relatively obscure KGB officer in the early 90s. Was this nostalgia for the Soviet Union, this idea that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a historic catastrophe and that it was going to end terribly and that the West were colonializers? Did this exist before Putin? And was it when you were a BBC correspondent in Russia in the early 90s? Did you hear it amongst people you talked to?
Do you mean after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the older generation, and completely understandable. This is the generation who had fought in the Second World War, in the Great Patriotic War. They defeated Nazism, and they were now being told that everything they'd fought for, essentially the ideals of a communist society, was being consigned to the trash can of history. So to hear that is a dreadful thing, because you feel that your whole life has been wasted. And among that older generation, of course, there was nostalgia for the Soviet Union when things were, quiet and happy, and we got on with our life and we didn't have to make choices. There was that. But the overwhelming feeling, and certainly among the younger generation, was that Russia was now going to open up to the West. We were going to be part of the West. We were going to enjoy the benefits of the West, the prosperity of the West. And the remarkable thing, which we should certainly talk about, is that Vladimir Putin was part of that. He absolutely signed up to that rosy vision of the West and where Russia should be heading.
Yeah, and I want to, as I said, I want to get to Putin after the break. One final question before we get to the break. The nostalgists for the Soviet Union, when they pointed their fingers at the villains at the end of communism, was it Gorbachev or Yeltsin mostly that they were angry with?
Well, it was absolutely, initially it was Gorbachev, because he remained a hero in the West, because he presided over the collapse of communism, over the enemy that the West had had for all those years. So he was regarded as a heroic figure. The truth is, he didn't want to destroy communism. He was a communist right to the very end of his life. What he'd seen was that communism was in crisis, the economy was falling apart, and he had to do something to try and reinvigorate communism. So his economic experiments were to try and bolster communism, not to make it fall apart. And when things did fall apart, then of course he got the blame. He was a hero in the West, he was a zero in Russia. And then the next step was that Yeltsin, who presided over those 9 years of economic meltdown when people's savings were wiped out, inflation ran out of control, there was violence on the streets, then it was Yeltsin who was blamed. So yes, they both got the blame.
What is it about Russia, Martin, that makes us in the West so idealistic or hopeful? We have, it seems I'm speaking we, the the United States, Western Europe, have this odd relationship with Russia that more than any other place, it seems, in the world, we want it to become like us. That's our history, whether it's Catherine the Great or Peter or the Bolsheviks or the 19th century czars or Yeltsin or Gorbachev. What is it about Russia that brings out, maybe it's the best, maybe it's the worst in us?
Well, I'm not sure it brings out anything in us. I mean, the problem is it's a very big superpower, or has been a superpower, sitting right on our doorstep. And for us, they look like us, they sound like us, they're broadly a Christian Western style, culturally based society. So we immediately think they should be like us, but we just don't take account of the fact that they're not. Russia is a massive place. Half of it's in Asia, half of it's in Europe.
I mean, it'd be funny, Martin, if your point is they look like, or you said they look like us. Maybe if they were darker skinned or different religions, Islamic or something, we wouldn't have this weird love-hate relationship with Russia. We are speaking with Martin Sixsmith, the author of Putin and the Return of History. He's a man who knows his Russia, not just as a historian. He was the BBC man in Moscow in the early 1990s. So he saw the fall of communism. And now he has a new book out about the rise of Vladimir Putin and the return of history. We're going to take a short break. I want to remind everyone that high-quality guests like Martin Sixsmith are brought to us because of our friends at Liberties, a quarterly journal of culture and politics, excellent new publication. Going to run a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Martin Sixsmith to talk about the rise and rise and rise of Vladimir Putin. Don't go away, anyone.
News, the noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with Martin Sixsmith, the author of Putin and the Return of History. He wrote it with his son. Martin, we haven't talked about Putin yet. So many books written about him. So I'm sure you've read most of them. Lots of debate about how he came to power. Some people suggest that he was brought to power by some sort of clique. He was a non-entity. Others suggest that there was always a plan in Putin's mind. How would you explain the fact that a man who was completely unknown in the West, some obscure KGB officer, suddenly became, quote unquote, the Tsar of Russia?
Well, it's the way that history happens, isn't it? It's about being in the right place at the right time. As you say, he'd been a minor KGB officer. His superiors had him down as a sort of mediocre agent, a middle-ranking agent. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, he got a job with the mayor of St. Petersburg, who was in himself a liberal. He was a supporter of democracy.
Is that Chvaez?
He was Sobchak, Anatoly Sobchak. He was the mayor of St. Petersburg. And he took Putin on. So Putin, for those years when he was working in the mayor's department in St. Petersburg, he became a liberal. He was a bit of a chameleon, which is, a great quality to have if you're an ambitious politician. And so he claimed at that time to support all the ideals of support for freedom, support for democracy, for capitalist economics. He said all the right things. And that brought him to the attention of Boris Yeltsin. You have to remember in those days, Yeltsin, he was the president of Russia, but he had a prime minister. And whenever anything went wrong, Yeltsin used to change the prime minister. He never really sort of took responsibility for what's going wrong. He'd say, it was the prime minister's fault. We need a new prime minister. So towards the end of his time in power, he was casting around for a suitable replacement. And he got a recommendation from somebody in St. Petersburg for this young fellow, smart, bright, former KGB, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, who might suit the purpose. So he came in initially as Yeltsin's deputy head of administration, and then when the prime minister's job came vacant in August 1999, Putin stepped into it. But it's, everybody at that time, I remember thinking, well, he's just another prime minister who'll be here today and gone tomorrow. But then circumstances just worked out perfectly for him, because in December 1999, Yeltsin decided he'd had enough. He hadn't come to the end of his term as president, but he just threw in the towel. And so on December the 31st, he made a speech saying, "That's it, I'm off, I'm going, and I've got a really good guy who's going to take over. Here he is." And then up stepped Vladimir Putin.
You've written this book, Martin, Putin and the Return of History. You're a historian, but you're also a journalist. You've worked on the ground. What did the writing of this book and your experience in Russia, what does that teach us about individuals and history? Was Putin made by history, or did history make Putin? And you note him as a Russian chameleon, a kind of Russian Zelig. Did he know what he was doing, or did he just get lucky?
Both. I mean, he definitely knew what he wanted. He was always extremely ambitious. He was always quite greedy. His time in St. Petersburg, he amassed quite a large personal fortune for those days in ways which were a little bit murky. So he wanted power, he wanted money, but lots of people want that, and not everybody gets to be the president of Russia. But Putin did, and that was because things fell into his lap. As I said, he became the acting president at the end of 1999. And then when the actual presidential elections came round in the spring of 2000, he had his feet under the desk, and he'd been quite clever at maneuvering things. He'd whipped up the sort of patriotic sentiment, which he was very adept at whipping up, and even more in later years, against the Chechen separatists. The Chechens had been wanted. Chechnya is part of Russia. It's not one of the other 14 republics. It is an integral part of Russia, but they wanted independence as well. And Putin saw a good political cause there. So he whipped up anti-Chechen sentiment, sent in the troops, and the Russian people suddenly got behind this man who looked like he was a tough guy. He was very different from Yeltsin. He didn't drink. He didn't stumble over his words. He didn't trip over. He didn't make a fool of himself. He'd been in the KGB, so he looked like the sort of person who could bring Russia back from the brink, back from the chaos of those 1990 years. And he got lucky, but he was very adept at using the circumstances that were presented to him.
What about his relations with the West? I seem to remember that George Bush, echoing or borrowing, remixing Margaret Thatcher, suggested that he looked into Putin's eyes and he trusted what he saw. What was Putin's view of relations with the West? Was it always was he always interested simply in getting as much as he could from the West? Was he from the beginning hostile to Western liberalism?
On the contrary, he wasn't hostile at all, or at least he proclaimed himself not to be hostile. He proclaimed himself to be a supporter of Western values. Not only George Bush, but Tony Blair and other Western politicians looked into his eyes and said, here's a man we can trust. Here's a man we can do business with. And he said all the right things. He said, like Yeltsin before him, we want a cooperation agreement with the European Union. And when George Robertson, who was the head of NATO in those days, went to Moscow, Putin sat him down at the table and he said, "George, I've been learning English. I'd like to practice my English on you. And I have a question for you. When are you going to invite Russia to join NATO?" So, can you imagine it? 20 years ago, it bears no resemblance to the Putin that we know nowadays. So for the first 3 years at least of his presidency, Putin was being, or proclaiming himself to be, a good friend of the West, a supporter of liberal values, a supporter of freedom, and a supporter of democracy. So we have a question. What happened?
Exactly.
20 years on, he's none of those things. He's a sort of swivel-eyed megalomaniac invading sovereign states. So there are two, in my mind, there are two answers. Either he was just lying back in 2000 and 2002 and 2003 when he said he wanted freedom and democracy, and he was, he was dissembling. He was out to get as much as he could from the West by telling lies. Or if he was serious back then, something must have happened in the 20 years between then and now to make him change his mind. And his version is that that is exactly what happened, that something made him change his mind. And I think it's we might not take it at face value, we might not believe him, but it's something that's worth exploring. And the West hasn't been very good at doing that.
Because we have to look at ourselves. We've done, as I said, lots of shows on Putin. A lot of people think that he's trying to reinvent himself as a czar. We had Mark Galeotti, London-based Russia watcher, who believes that Putin thinks and acts like a warmongering 19th century imperialist. We did one with a graphic artist, Andrew Weiss, who has represented Putin as an accidental czar. In terms of your return to history, is Putin consciously returning us and his country and the West to history, to this endless war, and even before the Cold War, between the West and Russia that goes back to the 18th and 19th centuries?
With the return of history is essentially, Putin saying that Fukuyama was wrong, that liberal democracy isn't the be-all and end-all.
Well, everyone, I mean, even Fukuyama admits that he was wrong. So we don't need Vladimir Putin to tell us that. But
so what the West has done wrong, you asked what the West could have done. It's made one of the sort of very fundamental mistakes of any war. And the Duke of Wellington very famously said that the whole art of war depends on guessing what's on the other side of the hill. In other words, knowing where your enemy is coming from, knowing how he thinks, knowing what his aims are. We need to understand our enemy. And the West has sort of willfully failed or refused to do that with Putin. We've simply said, the guy's a madman. He invaded Ukraine. There's no logic at all behind what he's doing. We can't even sort of try to understand what's, where he's coming from. It may be true. He may be a madman. But in Putin's own mind, there is a logic. And we've failed to try to understand that logic. And I think we're doing ourselves a disservice by not trying to understand the way Putin thinks. So if I was to sort of try and figure out where he's coming from, and this is something he said it in his very famous interview with Tucker Carlson the other week. He said that up until 1991, the Soviet Union felt secure because it had its satellite states in Eastern Europe. It had its buffer states in the Comecon countries, the Warsaw Pact countries. And then everything changed. So in 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. And Russia, the Kremlin, wanted some guarantees that Russia's always felt very vulnerable to invasion from the West. You only have to look at Hitler and Napoleon to understand that. So Moscow was looking for guarantees. And in December 1989, I was in Malta for the summit between Mikhail Gorbachev and George Bush Sr. And the wall had come down. And what Bush wanted was for Gorbachev to say, we won't impede the peaceful reunification of Germany. And Gorbachev gave that undertaking, and Bush was very pleased. But Gorbachev, in return, wanted something from the West. It wanted some reassurance that this vacuum, which had opened up in Eastern Europe, which had been the former Warsaw Pact countries, wouldn't be exploited by the West. And Bush gave him that undertaking. And then 2 months later, in February 1990, I was in Moscow when Bush's Secretary of State, James Baker, came to Moscow, and the same conversation was had. And James Baker said twice, not 1 inch eastwards, not 1 inch eastwards. In other words, NATO wouldn't advance into that sensitive territory that Russia had regarded as its own. And in Putin's mind, the West broke all those promises because NATO inexorably advanced into Poland, Romania, Czech Republic, the Baltic states, and then eventually it wanted to advance into Ukraine. And in Putin's mind, that was the straw that broke the camel's back. He wasn't going to take it anymore. So that's Putin's logic. I'm not saying it's my logic. I'm just saying that it is a logic in his mind, and we haven't tried to understand that logic. And I think we've done
he's
ourselves
not
a disservice.
as you say, he's not a madman. We did a show with Brian Klass on what a scan of Putin's power-addled brain might tell us. Maybe his brain isn't that different from Western statesmen. The subtitle of your book, Martin, is Putin. The subtitle of the Putin and the Return of History book, your new book, is How the Kremlin Rekindled the Cold War. But in the way you just told it, it perhaps might suggest that it's not just the Kremlin rekindling the Cold War, it's also the West in their unwillingness to acknowledge the historic insecurity of Russia on its Western boundaries. Have both the Kremlin and Western powers, particularly the US, do they both have a responsibility of rekindling the Cold War?
Well, there's no doubt that the blame, if we're to apportion it, lies massively with Vladimir Putin. He's the man who invaded Ukraine. He's the man who's brought war back to Europe. But we might also, as people from the West, we might also have a look at ourselves. And I just want to make one thing clear. I'm not an apologist for Vladimir Putin.
No,
I've written very critically
I'm not
about him,
suggesting you
and
are,
I've been on the and I've written very critically about it about him, and I've been on the end of a lot of vitriol from his trolls and his bots. But what I am saying is maybe we should just try and listen to what he's saying. So if I were to make the case for Vladimir Putin, if I were to act as devil's advocate, I might say that and I know that NATO is not an aggressive alliance. It's an alliance of mutual defense. But Putin doesn't know that, and he doesn't believe that. And when NATO started talks about having Ukraine as a member, he called his generals together, and he said that if that happens, there will be NATO missiles, enemy missiles, stationed on territory from which they can strike Moscow within 10 minutes. And, I'm sure you remember in 2003, when Washington and London used the claim that Saddam Hussein's missiles could hit Cyprus in 45 minutes as a reason for invading Iraq. Okay. So, Putin's now got missiles 10 minutes away or 5 minutes away if they're supersonic missiles. So he's making a similar case to the case that Blair and Bush made back then. It's not a perfect parallel, and I'm not saying it's right, but I'm just saying that this may be the way Putin is thinking. And if I were to, go on and really want to be Putin's spokesperson, which I'm not, I might say, well, let's have a look back to the end of the Second World War, a time when Europe was in flux, when politics was all over the place. And let's say back then, in the early years of the Cold War, that a communist government had come to power in France, something which was, certainly not out of the question. And let's say that communist government took a lot of money from Moscow, and in return, Moscow said, well, we'd like to station our missiles in Calais and Boulogne, just over the channel from England. And let's say Moscow said, well, these missiles, then they're not, the UK doesn't need to be worried about these missiles because they're not offensive missiles, they're purely defensive. I mean, I think you can see where I'm coming from with this parallel that, NATO has kind of done the same thing with its missiles in Eastern Europe. So that's maybe the way that Putin is thinking. And I think we do well to try and have a think about how Putin is actually thinking.
So, Martin, finally, we are where we are in the Ukraine. We've done many shows on the war there and how to end it. What does your book, Putin and the Return of History, what does it tell us about getting beyond the war in Ukraine and rebuilding, quote unquote, our relations with Putin. He's there for a sixth term, maybe he'd be there for seventh and eighth, who knows? But it's clearly in everyone's interest to maintain at least peaceful relations with him. What needs to happen? What needs to be done?
Yeah, I mean, it is true. As my Irish friends say when they're asked for directions, I wouldn't be starting from here, but we are where we are. And it is a fact that Putin will be there for at least 6 years, maybe 12 years. And we need to find a better way to get on with the guy. I mean, I know we've not completely broken off negotiations. There are always back channels going on during any conflict, during any war. And all wars, virtually all wars, end around the negotiating table. So I think we need to be planning for that. And I think it was quite instructive that on the eve of war, in February 2022, when it was clear that the Russian forces were about to advance into Ukraine, there was a flurry of diplomatic activity. The West suddenly decided that it did want to negotiate with Putin over the arguments, over the complaints that he'd been raising for many, many months. So essentially that Ukraine shouldn't be allowed to be a member of NATO, and that NATO forces in the East European states on Russia's western border should be controlled and reduced. And at that moment, in extremis, when war was about to happen, the West was suddenly interested and willing to have those talks. They didn't get anywhere, but obviously because the invasion happened, but the West was willing to talk about compromises. We were saying, well, we're not going to rule out Ukraine joining NATO because we have an open door policy, but maybe we can sort of discuss conditions. Maybe we can discuss delays. Maybe we can discuss it not happening for a long time. And maybe we can look at the level of NATO forces in Eastern Europe. Maybe we could have, negotiations and controls over those. And we did all that when Putin was pointing a gun at our heads. Wouldn't it have been much better if we'd had those negotiations months, if not years earlier? And might we not have invaded the terrible humanitarian catastrophe which is now going on in Ukraine if we'd done that? So, okay, hindsight is a great thing. And, it's no good saying we should have done this, we should have done that. But maybe we should try and let that sort of spirit of trying to listen, trying to talk, trying to understand what's being asked of us, permeate our politics as we now go forward.
And is there a deal that Putin would be willing to make on Ukraine? Your book is Putin in the Return of History. Lots of people compare Putin with Hitler, which I think is rather silly. Are there historical figures, if we have returned to history, that Putin might be willing to emulate? Catherine or Peter, they did deals with the West. Why wouldn't Putin do a deal?
They kind of did deals. I mean, Catherine was she was the empress who was really taken with the ideals of the French liberal Renaissance. She corresponded with Diderot and Voltaire, and she spoke about democracy. And then suddenly she saw the French monarchy having their heads chopped off, and she decided, oh, actually, I don't want this to happen. And she sort of scurried back down the road towards centralized autocracy. So she didn't do much of a deal. Will Putin do a deal? All wars end around a negotiating table. I'm sure there are conditions Putin would accept. Whether they'd be acceptable to the West or not, I'm not completely certain. And the added problem is that Putin is a liar. I mean, he signs deals and then he tears them up. There was there was a proto deal signed, the Minsk Accords of 2015, signed to try and solve the problem in Ukraine. But don't trust Putin is essentially the thing. So if you're going to get a binding agreement, you have to have some sort of controls which make sure that he sticks by it. But
and is there a historical figure,
Martin,
coming back? You don't see much of a parallel between Putin and Catherine. Obviously, the Hitler one is rather childish. Is there someone from the past who might help us make sense of Putin, given that we've returned, for better or worse, to history?
Not that I can think of. Putin is in the mold of the autocratic Tsar who rules Russia through a personalized autocracy, verging on dictatorship. And that has been the model for Russian history for 1,000 years. There have been interludes of democratic experiment. think about the liberation of the serfs. We think about the period between February and October in 1917. We think about the 1990s. And sadly, they've never worked out. Russia has always reverted to this, what they call the silnaya ruka, the strong hand, the iron fist of centralized authoritarianism. And, you know, as far as I can see, we're going to have to sort of deal with that. We're not going to change them. We have to deal with